It was a quiet morning in the city of Jerusalem. Merchants were opening their shops, children were chasing each other through narrow streets, and travelers from faraway towns were entering through the city gates. The temple stood tall in the sunlight, its stone walls shining white and gold. Around it, people gathered to pray, learn, and ask questions. Among the crowd was a man known as a lawyer, not someone who argued in court, but one who studied God's laws carefully. He had spent his life reading the scriptures and teaching others what they meant. His long robe and serious face showed that he took his job very seriously. That day, he had heard that Jesus of Nazareth was teaching nearby. Jesus had become famous for his stories, his kindness, and his wisdom. Many people followed him, hoping to learn more about God. Some religious leaders were curious, others were suspicious. The lawyer was one of those who wanted to see if Jesus truly understood the law. So he came with a question, but also with a plan to test him. He walked through the crowd and stood where everyone could see him. With a clear voice, he said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" The people around turned to Jesus, waiting to hear how he would respond. Eternal life was no small matter. It meant living with God forever. Every faithful person hoped for it, but not everyone agreed on how to receive it. Jesus looked at the lawyer kindly. Instead of giving an answer right away, he asked a question in return. "What is written in the law?" Jesus said, "How do you read it?" The lawyer was pleased. He had spent years memorizing scripture, and he was ready with an answer. He said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus nodded. "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." The lawyer stood still. The answer was good. It came from the most important commandments. Still, something bothered him. Jesus had not praised him or said that he was already doing these things. Instead, he had said, "Do this," as if something was missing. Wanting to prove himself, the lawyer asked a second question. His tone was sharp, and his eyes searched Jesus for any sign of weakness. "And who is my neighbor?" It was a clever question. In Jewish teaching, the word neighbor was sometimes used to mean fellow Israelites, those from the same family of faith, but others thought it meant anyone nearby, even if they were strangers or outsiders. The lawyer hoped Jesus would give a clear and narrow answer, one that kept the command simple and easy to follow. But Jesus did something unexpected. He did not reply with a long list or a rule. He did not say, "Your neighbor is a person from your village," or only those who believe the same things you do. Instead, Jesus answered the lawyer's question with a story. He began slowly, so everyone could hear. His voice was calm, but full of meaning. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. The people leaned in. They knew that road. It was steep and rocky, leading through lonely hills and dangerous places. Many had traveled it before. Some had heard of robbers hiding along the path. Others had seen people injured there. It was the kind of road that made you walk a little faster and look over your shoulder. Jesus was not just telling a story, he was taking them on a journey. The question about a neighbor was about to be answered, not with a definition, but with a picture that would stay in their hearts and minds forever. The lawyer had come to test Jesus. Jesus was about to test the heart of everyone listening. Jesus began to speak, and the crowd fell silent. The lawyer had asked who his neighbor was, but Jesus chose to answer by telling a story. Every word he spoke painted a picture in the minds of those who listened. The people leaned in, drawn by the power of his voice and the truth behind his words. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. The crowd could easily imagine that road. It twisted and turned through rocky hills, dipping down between dry cliffs and lonely valleys. It was a path known to travelers, but also feared by many. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was dangerous. Robbers often waited behind boulders or hid in narrow passes. People had been attacked there before. It was not a place to travel alone. Jesus continued. As he traveled, robbers came upon him. The people around Jesus held their breath. They could picture it clearly. The man walking with his cloak wrapped around him, dust on his sandals, maybe carrying a small pack with money or food. The robbers must have jumped out from behind a rock, shouting, grabbing, striking. There was no one nearby to help. They stripped him of his clothes. Jesus said, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now the picture became sharper. The man lay still on the ground, bruised and bleeding. His clothes were gone. His money was stolen. He had no protection, no help, and no strength to move. The hot sun beat down on his skin, and dust filled his mouth. The road was quiet again. The robbers had run off. No one knew what had happened. No one came. The crowd began to wonder. Would anyone come to help? Would someone pass by? Jesus gave the answer. A priest happened to be going down the same road. Ah, a priest. That gave people hope. A priest was a man of God, someone who served in the temple, someone who offered sacrifices and prayers. Surely, if anyone would stop and help, it would be a priest, Jesus said. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. The people frowned. They did not expect that. The priest had seen the wounded man, but he had not gone to him. He had crossed to the other side of the road. Maybe he had been in a hurry. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he thought the man was already dead. But still, he did not stop. He left the man alone. Jesus continued. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. A Levite was also a servant of God, someone who helped in the temple, someone who knew the law and honored the traditions. Two religious men had passed the man on the road. Both had seen him. Both had walked away. The crowd was quiet. They did not know what to say. Some were confused. Others were uncomfortable. This story was not turning out the way they had expected. They had hoped for a hero. Instead, they were seeing something hard to accept. Jesus let the silence linger for a moment. Then he said, "But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was." Now the crowd stirred again, this time with surprise. A Samaritan. Samaritans and Jews did not get along. They had a long history of mistrust and disagreement. Most Jews avoided Samaritans. They did not eat together, worship together, or even speak kindly of one another. Yet here was a Samaritan on the road. No one expected him to be the helper. If anything, people thought he might ignore the wounded man or even make things worse. But Jesus said, when he saw him, he took pity on him. The Samaritan's heart was moved. He did not see an enemy or a stranger. He saw a man in need. And, unlike the others, he did not walk away. He stepped forward. This was not the story people were ready for. The priest and the Levite, who should have been the ones to show kindness, had walked past. The Samaritan, the one who was different, the one who might have been hated, was the one who stopped. Jesus was not just telling a story about a man on a road. He was showing what true love looked like. Love that crosses boundaries. Love that sees with compassion. Love that acts. The crowd waited for what would happen next. The man was still hurt. The Samaritan had stopped. What would he do? Jesus continued. The Samaritan stood still on the dusty road, his eyes fixed on the broken figure lying ahead. The man's body was bruised and bloodied, his clothing gone, and his breathing weak. He had clearly been beaten and left to die. The Samaritan did not know who he was or where he had come from. He could not tell if the man was rich or poor, old or young, or even whether he was a fellow Samaritan or a Jew. But none of that mattered. The Samaritan saw someone in need. and he was moved by compassion. He stepped off his donkey and hurried to the man. His sandals crunched against the gravel as he knelt beside him. The man did not speak. His eyes were barely open. The Samaritan gently reached out and touched his shoulder, trying not to cause more pain. He opened his travel pack and took out a small jar of oil and another of wine. These were not made for healing. The wine was meant to refresh after a long day, and the oil was used for cooking or softening the skin after sun exposure. But in the hands of someone who cared, these simple things became medicine. He poured the wine on the man's wounds to clean them. The alcohol stung, but it kept infection away. Then he poured on the oil to soothe the raw, torn skin. The Samaritan worked carefully, like someone helping a friend. He did not rush. He did not complain. He simply did what needed to be done. Next, he took strips of cloth and wrapped the wounds. Perhaps he tore pieces from his own robe or used bandages from his pack. He bound the man's arms and legs and pressed gently against his side. The man winced, but he did not pull away. The Samaritan looked down the road. They were far from any town. There were no inns or homes nearby. The man could not walk. He could barely lift his head. The Samaritan knew what he had to do. He walked over to his donkey and led it to the side of the road. Then he gently lifted the man and placed him across the animal's back. It was not easy. The man's body was limp, and the Samaritan had to use all his strength. But he managed. The Samaritan took the reins and began walking. Now the man rode, and the Samaritan walked. Every step was slower than before. The road was still hot and dangerous. He could not ride or rest, but he did not turn back. He moved forward with a steady pace, keeping his eyes on the road and his thoughts on the wounded traveler. By the time they reached the next town, the sun had begun to set. The Samaritan's feet were sore and his throat dry, but he did not think of himself. He looked for a place to stay, and soon he found an inn with a courtyard and a shaded roof. He knocked and called for the innkeeper. When the door opened, he explained what had happened and asked for a room. The innkeeper saw the man on the donkey and quickly helped bring him inside. Together, they laid him on a mat. The Samaritan stayed through the evening, checking his breathing, adjusting the bandages, and giving him water. He stayed the night, watching over the man, ready to help if he stirred in pain or called out in fear. When morning came, the Samaritan stood and stretched his tired back. He had done everything he could. It was time to continue his journey, but he would not leave the man without help. He reached into his pouch and pulled out 2 silver coins. They were enough to pay for several nights at the inn, maybe more. He gave them to the innkeeper and looked him in the eye. "Take care of him," the Samaritan said. "Whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I return." The innkeeper nodded. He could see the kindness in the traveler's face and the seriousness of his promise. Then the Samaritan picked up his pack, took the reins of his donkey, and stepped back onto the road. He left quietly, without asking for thanks or reward. He had done what he believed was right. A stranger had become a helper. A traveler had become a neighbor, and the story was not over yet. The crowd around Jesus was still and silent. Every listener, from the children clinging to their mothers to the elders standing with furrowed brows, was locked into the story. The lawyer who had asked the question stood in place, his hands clasped, his eyes uncertain. He had asked, "Who is my neighbor?" But now Jesus had taken him deeper into something far more challenging. A man had been beaten and left to die. A priest and a Levite had passed him by, but a Samaritan, a man from a group that Jews often looked down on, had stopped. He had shown mercy. He had gone out of his way to help someone he did not know, someone who might not even have liked him. And now that same man had left the wounded traveler in an inn with a promise that he would return and cover any extra costs. Jesus let the story hang in the air for a moment. He looked at the lawyer. His gaze was not angry or harsh, it was thoughtful, like he was inviting the man to see something he had never seen before. "Which of these three," Jesus asked, "do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" It was the question that brought everything together. The lawyer had started with a different question. He had asked, "Who is my neighbor?" hoping to draw a line between those he had to love and those he did not. But Jesus did not give him a list of names or a set of rules. Instead, Jesus showed him what it meant to be a neighbor. Now the lawyer had to answer. He looked down at the ground for a moment. Maybe he thought of the priest and the Levite, men he would normally respect. They knew the law. They served in the temple. Yet they had passed by a suffering man. Then he thought of the Samaritan, someone he had likely been taught to avoid, someone he might never speak to on the road or greet in a market. Yet that man had stopped. That man had helped. That man had shown love. The answer was clear. The lawyer said, the one who had mercy on him. He could not even bring himself to say the word Samaritan, but he knew what was right. Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." It was a command filled with challenge and hope. Jesus did not tell him to think about it or to agree with the idea in his mind. He told him to act, to live out the truth of the story in his own life, to go and to show the same mercy that the Samaritan had shown. The people listening were still thinking about the story. Some were amazed. Others were uncomfortable. The idea that a Samaritan could be the hero of a story meant to teach love and mercy was new and hard to accept for many, but Jesus was not trying to make people feel comfortable. He was calling them to live differently, to love differently, to see everyone, even strangers or enemies, as people made by God and deserving of compassion. The lawyer had wanted to test Jesus, but in the end, it was his own heart that had been tested. He had come looking for limits. Jesus had shown him the limitless nature of God's love. The story had ended, but its meaning remained. It was more than a tale about it was a call to action, a reminder that being a neighbor means more than living near someone. It means helping, healing, and loving without waiting to be asked. As the people drifted away from the place where Jesus was teaching, many of them talked about the story. Some asked questions. Others thought quietly to themselves. Who had they passed by without helping? Were they like the priest, walking quickly past the pain of others? Or were they willing to be like the Samaritan, even when it was costly? The lawyer, too, walked away in silence. He had asked a simple question, but he had received an answer that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The road to Jericho was still dangerous. People would still walk it, and some would still fall. But now, those who heard Jesus' story would think twice before passing by. They had seen what it meant to be a true neighbor, and Jesus had called them to go and do the same. The dust had not yet settled on the road to Jericho. In the minds of those listening to Jesus, the picture of the beaten man, the silent priest, the hurried Levite, and the kind Samaritan still lingered. Though Jesus had finished speaking, his words were far from finished. They were working their way into hearts. The lawyer who had asked the question stood quietly. He had come with confidence, sure that his knowledge would earn him praise. Instead, he found himself challenged by a truth deeper than law, deeper than tradition. He had expected Jesus to say that a neighbor was someone within the same faith, the same town, or the same family, but Jesus had shown him something more powerful. A neighbor is not just someone close by. A neighbor is anyone who needs help. The lawyer had answered correctly. The one who showed mercy was the true neighbor. But Jesus did not simply praise his answer. He said, "Go and do likewise." Those words echoed like a bell in a quiet field. Simple, yet powerful. Easy to understand, but difficult to carry out. Jesus was not giving advice. He was giving direction. Go, do live this story. Jesus was not just teaching a lesson for the mind. He was teaching a lesson for the heart. The people in the crowd began to reflect. What did it mean to love like the Samaritan? Was it only about helping someone who was hurt? Or was it something more? One boy in the crowd turned to his father and asked, "Would we help a Samaritan if he were hurt?" The father hesitated before he answered. The truth was, he had never thought of helping a Samaritan. He had always been taught to keep his distance. But now, after hearing Jesus, he could no longer ignore the question. In another corner of the crowd, a woman whispered to her friend, "I saw a man by the gates last week, sitting alone and sick. I walked past him." Her friend nodded slowly. "So did I." Jesus had opened their eyes. The lesson was not just about robbers and roads. It was about love that moves beyond borders. It was about mercy that does not stop to ask where someone is from. It was about choosing to act when others do not. And it was about doing so quietly, without looking for reward. The Samaritan had not waited for permission. He had not wondered what others would think. He had seen a need, and he had responded. This was the kind of love that God had always intended for his people. Jesus often taught in parables, using everyday things to show eternal truths. But this story touched a nerve. It was not just about what others should do. It was about what each person must do. The lawyer had learned that the greatest commandments were to love God and love your neighbor. Now Jesus had shown him what that love looked like in real life. Loving God meant listening to his voice and obeying his call. Loving your neighbor meant helping, healing, and sacrificing when needed. The story left no space for excuses. It did not matter if the person in need looked different or believed differently. It did not matter if helping would take time or cost money. It did not even matter if others would laugh or walk away. What mattered was mercy. The lawyer stepped back from the crowd and walked slowly down the street. He passed shops and homes, greeted by familiar faces. But his heart was no longer the same. Every person he saw was now a reminder of the story. He had spent his life studying the law. Now he had to live it. The people who remained around Jesus continued to talk among themselves. Some asked, "What if I am the one lying hurt on the road one day?" Others said, "Maybe God sends help through those we least expect." Jesus did not answer every question. He had said enough. The story had done its work. He turned and walked quietly along the path, leading away from the city. But behind him, seeds had been planted. In the hearts of children, in the thoughts of elders, in the minds of men and women who had once drawn lines between friend and enemy. Now they were asking better questions. Not who is my neighbor, but how can I be a neighbor? And that question was just the beginning. The city of Jerusalem settled into the rhythm of the afternoon. Merchants continued to call out their goods. Sandals scuffed across stone streets, and temple bells rang softly in the distance. But in the hearts of those who had listened to Jesus, something had shifted. His story had done more than entertain or impress. It had opened a door to something deeper. In homes and alleyways, the parable of the Good Samaritan was being retold. Children asked their parents to repeat it. Friends whispered about it behind baskets of figs and loaves of bread. Even those who had not been there heard it from someone who had. The story moved faster than any written scroll. It was alive. One of the most surprising parts, the one that made people raise their eyebrows and look at each other in disbelief, was this simple truth. The hero of the story was a Samaritan. To many Jewish listeners, this was a shock. Samaritans were not trusted. Their history was tangled with disagreement and conflict. They worshipped in different places. They had mixed traditions for generations. Many Jews had kept away from Samaritans. They were not enemies in battle, but they were not considered friends either. Some people avoided them altogether. Yet Jesus had made the Samaritan the one who stopped, the one who felt compassion, the one who acted. This was not just surprising, it was challenging. In the crowd, there had been people who thought they already understood love. They gave offerings at the temple. They followed the rules. They spoke with kindness to their neighbors. But now they were wondering if their love had limits. What if God was asking for more? What if love was not supposed to stop at familiar faces and shared customs? What if love was meant to cross the border between people? The lawyer who had asked the question had spent his life trying to follow the law. He could quote them in the synagogue and explain them to others. But now, even he had to admit that love was not as narrow as he once believed. The Samaritan had no reason to stop on that road. He could have ridden past, just like the priest and the Levite. He could have said, "This is not my responsibility." He could have assumed that the injured man would not do the same for him. But he had not done any of those things. He had seen pain, and his heart had responded. That kind of love was powerful. It did not wait for permission. It did not ask, "Is this person like me?" It simply asked, "What can I do to help?" As the days passed, people began to see their neighbors differently. A man who once ignored the beggar near the well now brought him bread. A woman who used to cross the street to avoid strangers began greeting them with a smile. Children who had been taught to turn away from outsiders now looked at them with new eyes. Jesus had taught them that love has no walls. It does not keep itself locked behind traditions or boundaries. It does not wait for someone to be worthy. It simply moves, speaks, lifts, and gives. This was not just a story to remember. It was a truth to live. The road to Jericho was still dangerous. Robbers might still hide among the rocks. Travelers might still fall. But now, there was hope that someone might stop. Not just someone who looked like the wounded man, not just someone from the same village or the same faith. Anyone with a heart that had been touched by mercy could be that neighbor, and that meant everyone had a chance to be part of the story. In the markets, in the fields, in the homes where the parable was retold, people began to wonder what their part would be. Would they walk by with excuses, or would they stop with compassion? Jesus had left them with a choice. He had told them what it meant to be a neighbor. He had shown them that love is bigger than borders, and he had invited them all to go and do the same. The sun was setting over the city, painting the rooftops in warm orange light. The streets were quieter now, the busy chatter fading into evening songs and closing doors. But the story that Jesus had told still echoed in hearts and minds. The parable of the Good Samaritan had become more than just a tale. It had become a challenge. Some people walked away from Jesus feeling uncomfortable. Others walked away inspired. A few left in silence, thinking carefully about what they had just heard. And some stayed behind, sitting quietly, wondering what it would look like to live with that kind of love. Jesus had ended his story with one simple sentence: "Go and do likewise." These 4 words carried more weight than long speeches or written commands. They were not just instructions, they were a call to a new way of living. Go, do. Be like the Samaritan. It meant choosing to see others with eyes of compassion. It meant putting aside pride and prejudice. It meant stepping out of comfort and into action. The lawyer who had asked the question had learned a truth that no law book could fully explain. Being a neighbor was not about following a rule. It was about becoming a person who cares, a person who helps, a person who does not walk past when someone else is in pain. That day, Jesus redefined what love looked like. Love is not measured by how often someone prays or how many words of scripture they can repeat. Love is shown in how a person responds when someone is hurting. Love is not just a feeling, it is a choice, a step, a helping hand. All around the land, the story spread. People began to look at the world differently. In towns and villages, travelers who once walked quickly past the wounded or the sick now stopped to help. Children who once ignored others who were different now invited them to play. Shopkeepers gave bread to the hungry without expecting payment. Farmers shared with neighbors who had little. The story had changed hearts, and the words of Jesus kept working like seeds planted in good soil. In one town, a young boy remembered the story when he saw an old man stumble and fall in the street. No one else seemed to notice. Some kept walking, others looked but turned away. But the boy ran over, helped the man to his feet, and walked him home. When asked why he had helped, the boy simply said, "Because the Samaritan helped him." In another village, a woman who had always looked down on foreigners began to invite them to her table. She remembered how the Samaritan had been the one to show mercy. She realized that love does not stop at borders, it crosses them. And in the synagogue, teachers began to speak about mercy not as a concept to study, but as a life to live. They taught the parable of Jesus and reminded their listeners that being holy meant being kind, being faithful meant being willing to stop and help. The story continued to live because people continued to act. Even now, many years later, the parable of the Good Samaritan is still told. It is shared in churches, in schools, in homes, and in hearts. It is written in books and acted out in plays. But more than that, it is remembered in moments when someone chooses to love, when a child stands up for another who is bullied, when a stranger helps a family carry groceries, when someone visits a sick neighbor or shares a warm meal with a person in need. That is when the story comes alive again. Jesus did not just want people to admire the Samaritan. He wanted people to become like him, not because of praise, not because of reward, but because love is what God desires most. And so, the parable ends, not with a final line, but with an invitation. The invitation is for every person who hears it. You are invited to go and do the same, to be the person who sees the need, to be the one who crosses the road, to be the neighbor that Jesus described. Because in every act of mercy, in every step of compassion, in every moment of kindness, the love of God is made real. And that is the greatest story of all.